Okay, so I think we will now begin. And today what we're going to look at is editable grids. So what we're looking at on here is how to use editable grids, etc. And I'll just show you in a moment what's included. So just to tell you, my name is Shona Rochefort. I'm one of the CRM consultants at CRM Dynamics, and we'd just like to welcome you to this presentation. So what we're going to cover today, turning your views into editable grids, editing your grid in Excel, how to group the data, how to add editable subgrids to your forms, what to watch for when you're using them, and then any questions and answers. And of course, as we move along, you are welcome to add questions into the box on your conference call. Now, in terms of questions, feel free to ask questions as we go along. What we may do is, if it's more appropriate to wait until the end to answer the question, we'll do that. Cassandra is also sitting on the call and will try and help people. But if you do find that we just hold a moment, please, if you could just wait until the end, and then that will be okay for that as well. Okay, so let's then go straight into what we're doing. So let me just make sure that I can bring the system up here. So I'm just going to minimize this screen here, and then I'm going to bring up the dynamic system. Okay, can somebody just confirm that they can still see my system on here? Great, thank you very much. Okay, so what we're looking at is editable grids. Now, a couple of introductory points here. This is for 365. It's for Dynamics 365. This is something that has been introduced by Microsoft on Dynamics 365. So if you are not yet on 365, then you won't see this feature available yet. The other thing to mention is that this allows you to make changes without having to go into the record. This is the huge advantage of editable grids. Basically, you can make changes on the information that's on your system. You can see it as you're making it. You don't have to physically enter a record to go into the system. So what we've got here is I've just gone into a system that's just got basic information in it at the moment. You can see it's just got Dynamics test data in it. So you can see that there's a number of records on here. And this is one that I have already made into an editable grid. So I'm keeping it at a relatively simple level at the moment with just a few columns of data. But basically the information that you can put in could be information that's much more involved in terms of the number of columns that you've got in here. So this allows you to make changes, as I say, and once you've set up editable grids on an entity, the system will allow you to make changes on a grid basis to all the views that you have accessed for this entity. So in this case, what we're looking at here is my active accounts. If I turn to another entity, so say I turn to another view, say I turn to active accounts here, or say I turn to accounts I follow. Sorry, nothing in that one. Let's go back into active. The same setup will show for each of the views on that system. And what that will basically be is that you can see here, if I click into a record, that record now allows me to change it. Now you can actually see here, hopefully, that I've actually made a change to a record already. You can see Microsoft's test data is pretty generic in how it's set up. All the emails have been set up as someone@example.com with a number. I've already changed an email and I've already changed an account, and I did that through the editable grid. So I'm basically going to show you how that works. So let's take this one, AdventureWorks. I'm going to take off the word sample on it. So I'm going to click in it, and I can either just do it using my backspace here, or I could have highlighted the text and made a change. And then I'm going to tab off the record. I'm going to click in another part of the grid, and you can see here that I've been able to change that very easily on the grid itself. Now you'll also see that at the end here, there's a save button. And if I click that save button, that basically allows me to make all the changes that I've implemented onto my grid. So let's just change something else on here. Let's just say that we've got John at Adventure Works, which of course I can't spell, but there we are. And this time I'm going to save it again. And then my grid has updated. Now, if I click on this refresh button, which is a standard feature on the grid, that will refresh my grid for me, and you can see that my data shows there as actually changed. Now, having done that on the one grid, as I said, all the views that are showing on this entity are now operational in exactly the same way. I only had to make one change, and I will show you how to do that just in a moment if you're wondering. So I'm going to look at my active accounts, and I'm also going to look at a view that I've created myself. So in this case, I just created a very simple view called Accounts Beginning with A. If I click on that, I have the same functionality here. So you can see that for my A Datum Corporation, I actually changed something here. I'm going to change it back again. So this time I'm going to highlight all that text. I'm going to press my backspace, and then I'm going to hit my save button. And once again, my grid will now save with that record that's in the data that's in that record. So let's just click off that to show that, that the data has updated there. And then what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to open the record to show you that it has actually corrected. Now, when you have a record on an editable grid, that's one of the things. It's a little bit more to open it, in that if you double click it, you have to just make sure you're not actually on one of the grid bits to edit, because if you are, then you're going to edit that rather than actually open the record. But in this case, we've opened the record, and you can see here that I've got Redmond back in again. I've got my A datum showing with without the sample, and I've also got, I think the email was here somewhere as well. Maybe that's not showing on the screen, and that is updated in the record as well. So that's basically how you would make a change on an entity view that has a grid. Now, as I say, just be careful with this, because once you have one grid and you can edit it, then you can edit everything. And some people may not want people to be able to edit records on the grid like this for all the views. So just be careful when you decide to make your actual entity editable in itself. So how do you actually do that so that you can make the grids editable yourself? So to show you this, I'm going to move to another entity. So let's move from sales into contacts. So on the contacts, we have a number of contacts here. You'll see that we have, again, Microsoft standard set of data. And you can see, if you know this data at all, that I have made a couple of changes on here just to help us with the demonstration here. So you can see that at the moment, this is not an editable grid. If I go to any of the contact records here, I'm going to go to contact being followed. Well, that hasn't got any records, but it's still not edited. If I go to active contacts, that's not an editable grid either. So basically, this one is not yet editable. So what I want to do now is to be able to make this into an editable grid. So to do that, I have to have administrative access to the customization area. So that means that not everybody is going to be able to turn these into editable grids. It has to be somebody at the administration level. So if you are a user and you don't yet have this, and you would find it valuable to do it, then speak to the person in your team who is the administrator, and they should be able to do this for you. So I'm going to go to my customization area, and again, as I indicated, not everyone will have this area. This is the customization area for this view. Now, I could have just gone into the customizations through my settings options, customizations, view solution. So remember, as with a lot of things on Dynamics, there's a number of ways that you can do the same thing. And this has now taken me to my contacts area. So I'm going to stay on the main entity area, because remember, this is what I'm doing to affect the whole entity. So what I need to be able to do is stay on the entity level rather than the views. Even though it's the views that are affected, it's the entity that's being changed. Now you'll see on this panel here for the entity area that you now have an extra tab available to you called Controls. I'm going to click onto the Controls tab, and you'll see on here basically that there is a whole area where you can now add additional controls. So I'm going to click on the button that says Add Control, and you'll see that there are actually 3 options here. The one we're interested in at the moment is the Editable Grid. So I'm going to click on Editable Grid, and you can see that it gives you a little bit of indication here as to what the Editable Grid is doing. I'm going to click Add, and you'll now see that I have the functionality available on my contacts entity. Now, the next thing, though, that is important to note is that at the moment, it is not actually chosen for any of your 3 options. So you have to decide where you want people to be able to do their edits on the views. I'm going to click on Web and onto Phone and onto Tablet. So basically, what that means is you can see it's changing it from the read-only grid, and it's pushing it into the ability to be able to do edit. Now, which of the 3 you choose is up to you. Could be that you don't want people to be able to do it on a tablet because you think maybe that's going to be too fiddly for them, especially on a phone that may be considered too small. Generally speaking, I would certainly say the web is the one that you want to look at here. So now you've chosen your options, you're basically going to click your Edit Update here, or your Save button, so that you can update your entity. And then the most important step here is, as with everything that you do on the customizations, you must make sure that you click the Publish button. So on here, we're going to click our Publish button, and that's going to publish our customizations. Now, I'm going to just minimize my screen here for the solution, just to move it out of the way. And then I'm going to refresh my screen, because as with any of these customizations, before they will show on your screen, you have to make sure that you've refreshed it. Now, you can refresh it by going to a different screen and coming back, or you can click F5. Just because I've got all my screens open, I'm going to move to another screen, and then I'm going to go back onto the contact screen. So once I go back onto the contact screen, now you can see that my active contact view, which I was on, has now become an editable grid in exactly the same way as the other one was. So let's do the information on here, that we can see that I've got details here that can be changed. Now, as you can see from some of these areas, some records cannot be changed on the editable grid, even though they show on. And these ones here, you can see these are locked. Now, it could be a variety of reasons that you can't edit it on the screen. Let's just change this one here, just to show that this does change. So there's my screen changed on that one. And I'm going to hit my Save button so that I can save it here. But you'll see here that 2 of the fields actually have locked buttons on. Now, that could be for a variety of reasons. That could be because you physically locked the record. You made it so that it was a read-only file on the record. So say, for example, on an opportunity, it's the actual cost that's based on probability or something like that. And you don't want users being able to edit that either on the record or therefore on the editable grid. It could be that it links into another area which is showing as another entity, which also cannot be necessarily edited from the editable grid. It could be that it's part of something that you need to edit within the record. For example, on here, I think the full name is saying that you need to edit that inside because you need to be able to edit the first name and the last name. If you had those two on here, that would edit it. But the record itself as the full name is locked. So just be careful of that when you're putting your fields on and you're telling users that they can update specific records on the editable grid. It may be that some of them are not able to be edited and are really just there to help information on the view grid. So that's basically how you would add the editable grid and how you would make it accessible for people to be able to use it in any of the entities that they may choose to do so. Now, there is another area that allows you to edit the screen or edit the information on a screen, and that's the export to Excel functionality. Now, this isn't technically editable grids, but it's so similar to the ability to do an editable grid that we're just going to talk about it today as well. So to show this, I'm going to move to the cases area. The only reason I'm going to the cases area is that I know there's a little bit of data here that we can use. It could be any of the entities that you've been using. Now for this one, you don't need the ability to have editable grids set on your entity. You also do not need to have administrative access to be able to do this. Basically, what you're doing is you just have to have the appropriate security level within your role. So what we're going to do on this is we're going to say, okay, I've got a grid, I've got a number of fields on here. As I said, in this case, this is cases, my active cases. I want to update a lot of my cases in terms of perhaps the status reason or maybe even the title of the case. But I don't want to have to go into each individual record, and it's not something that I'm able to do on a bulk edit. So under here, you'll see that there's the ability to export to Excel. Now, you may be familiar with doing this in terms of exporting to Excel to get a list of the data that you then export to Excel and you manipulate or you turn it into a pivot chart or that kind of thing. There is also the ability, there is also the ability to open in Excel online. So I'm going to click this button, and that basically tells me that it's loading the data, and it's just giving me an Excel area here. So I'm just going to close this pop-up window. And now you'll see that I'm still within Dynamics. I've still got my Dynamics screen up. You can see I'm in Services Cases still, but this has turned this into basically an Excel document. And it's a sort of Excel online version of the document. And what this allows me to do then is to go on here and to make some changes. So let's make a couple of really basic changes. You can see I already did a couple here with taking off the sample. It's quite a nice one to show because you can easily see the samples come off. But let's change this, and we'll change, I don't see any that are high down here, so let's change all of these to, sorry, I'm just clicking the high here and just can't quite reach it. I'm going to change these option sets to high, just going to do 3 records here. And I'm going to change the origin here so that they all show, let's say Facebook, because that's something that's not showing yet, and will then be able to see the information there. So I just need to scroll down my window a bit and click Facebook, and then let's have the other one that's on Facebook as well. Now, that's changed my data. I mean, obviously, I've only done 3 little small changes, so it may not even have been worth doing it for this. But if you had a large number of records, this could be quite a useful way for you to be able to update things efficiently. So in this case, I've got 2 option buttons here at the top. One says Return to Dynamics 365 List, and one says Save Changes. If I click on the Return to 365, it basically tells me it's like I'm changing the I'm closing the document without actually saving it. So in this case, if I clicked OK here, I would go back to Dynamics. I'd have my grid showing as the view, and I wouldn't basically have changed anything and saved anything. So I don't want to do that. So I'm going to click Cancel here. So my other option is to save the changes to Dynamics. And what I'm going to do then is click that, and that basically tells me that it now re-imports this file or this set of data as an import. Now, some of you may not have used the import functionality, but basically this allows you to take an Excel spreadsheet, export it with data from Dynamics if you wish, or import data in using a mapping system. If you export it directly from Dynamics first and then import it, all the mapping is preset. So what this is saying is I have taken my active cases, I've exported it, I've made some changes, and now by doing this, I'm importing the information again. So on an import, the system basically tells you that it's importing the data. It also allows you to see what's happening on this import by going into your import area. So I'm going to close this window because that's nicely telling me that I've done something. And on here, I'm going to go to Service, I'm going to go to Settings, and I'm going to go to Data Management and just open that in a new link. When I click on my Data Management link, remember I've still got my cases here, I can click onto my Imports button here, and now I will see, and you can see the two that I was doing before, but now you can see that I've got an option here. It's on today's date. The server is sitting on Pacific time, which is why it's showing 8:21. But basically, this is showing that I imported records. I had 3 records processed. So bear in mind that even though I exported and imported that whole view, I only actually edited 3 records. And here it says that my records are successes. If I was to go into the actual location, I can see here that it's giving me all the information about records that were imported. Here's the ones that were fully imported, and it's telling me what my changes were. So let's go back onto our cases. I'm going to update my grid, and now you'll see there are my changes showing. So basically, by clicking on the export to Excel, I've been able to make those changes in a grid format and bring them back again. And as I said at the start of this area, this doesn't have to be set then as an editable grid. So this may be something that's more useful for people who perhaps a non-administrator cannot turn this into an editable grid, but still would like to be able to do a number of changes all at the same time. Okay, so that's basically showed us how we can make an editable grid and how we can edit the record on the editable grid. Now, let's have a look at, let's go back to our account because we know that's an editable grid now. We've got a couple of changes on there. So, what can this editable grid also do to help us? So, on the view again, what I'm looking at on the view here is my grid with a number of fields entered, some of which will have the same information. So let's look here at, for example, the address. Some of the addresses are going to be the same. So, for example, we have Redmond that has 3. I think maybe that's the only ones that have more than 1 at the moment. But you, of course, will have a large number of data, and you may have many columns that have similar data in. And it may be useful for you to be able to see that data grouped. So you'll see in the top left-hand corner here, there's actually a button that says Group By. And at the moment, that is set by no grouping. So I am just looking at all my records, which in this case is the 8 records, 8, 10 records, whatever it is. And I can see that in terms of just the list. However, if I drop this arrow here, you're basically seeing a list of the fields. And if I click on City, this basically means that I can now group all my records by a particular field. So in this case, I'm going to group by the address 1, which is the city. If we make this a little bit wider, we can see it's the city here. And basically what it's done is it's put it in alphabetical order, and it's also grouped with a mini heading here so that you can see the data in a particular area. So that may be useful for you. Say you've got owner as one of your fields and you want to group by owner so that you can easily go down and see who's maybe updated their records. who's still got some things outstanding, but you're looking at it in a group of records rather than having to sort on your view and then scroll down to find the appropriate and look at all the different sections. It's just something that can help you a little bit on the way here. Okay, so we've now looked at the views for editable grids, but there is another area that can be very useful as well for you to use for editable grids, and that's the subgrids within an area. So for this, I'm going to stay on my account screen, and I'm going to look at a particular record here for a datum. So I'm going to go into the record, and to go into the record, I can either double click in one of the empty spaces, or I can also click on this little arrow that takes me in. Now, the fact that I had an editable grid on the view is not significant for the subgrid. Basically, you can add an editable grid to a subgrid at any level of record. It doesn't have to be on an entity that has subgrids. The subview is completely independent of the views. So basically, you make your subgrid accessible on the record, and then you can set it for an editable grid. So let's look at how we can do that. So I'm going to take a subgrid that is already created, but of course you could do this when you create a physical subgrid. So I'm going to take it on my contact subgrid just because there's a little bit of data on there. I've got 5 records on there, and it just helps me to show the fact that I've got some edits on there. And I'm going to go into the form creation and configuration screen so that I can access my subgrid. Now, again, remember, this is a function that's accessible to the administrators, may not be accessible to everybody else. So I'm going to click on the 3 dots, and I'm going to, oh, sorry, the form is actually on here. I'm going to click on here to bring up my form for the current form that I'm on, so the configuration side. Now, of course, I could have done this through the configuration screen. I could have gone to my customization screen, gone to forms, opened the appropriate form, done it from there. There's nothing to stop you going one way or the other. So on my form here, I have all the configuration set up, and I'm going to scroll down to where it says on here that the subgrid for contacts is already located. So I'm going to double click so that that brings me up with the information here on my subgrid, and I am actually just going to reduce this in size a little bit so that I can see it when I have to, for the OK. So you'll see on here that this is my set properties for the subgrid. I've got it currently set up. It's showing the active contact subgrid view. It's showing all my details. That's fine for my subgrid that's set up. But you see up on the top here, I've got the 3rd tab again. Similar to what I had on the entity, I now have exactly the same tab on here in terms of my controls. Now, you also have the button here that allows you to add the editable grid. So here I've got my editable grid, and I can now add. Now you'll see that there's also a template editable grid. That is not the same as the direct editable grid. The functionality on there is for the template side. We don't need to worry about that today. On here, I've added the control. I've added my editable grid. And again, it's just like the same as we had with the entity one. I can add this onto the web, the phone, and the tablet. And then I'm going to press OK. Now, that's added it to my grid. I'm just going to double check. Sometimes I find when you do that, it changes the view that shows on here, but no, that's fine. It's changed it there, hasn't changed it there, so that's fine. I'm now going to save my record, and as with everything else on this, I'm going to publish the form. And sometimes it can take a little longer to publish. And so I'm going to just minimize that to get that out of the way. And then I'm going to refresh my screen again. So I'm going to refresh it just by bringing the record up again. And now I'm going to scroll down my record to my screen here. And now you can see that my record shows that this subgrid has now become an editable grid. Now this certainly, I think, if anything, I would find this probably more useful than the view, maybe about the same use, in that a lot of people go into a record, maybe something like the account, and then need to access things from there. That's why the subgrids are there. And to be able to do this straight from here without going into every single record is really useful. I mean, from here, I've got no departments entered. So this could have been something that got completely missed. Maybe it's a new field that you've added with a change, and you're asking people to go in and change all their, update all their department. They could do this for their own personal contacts on here by each company. Going into the company and saying, oh yeah, right, who are my contacts on here? Let me check, I've got this, I can update my department as I'm going on here. And then save my record. And then if I was to go into any of these records now, we would find that providing the department is on the screen, which it may not actually be on this one, but if the department is on the screen, then you can check it from that point that the system has updated it. So let's just go back to the account, and then we can see if I'm going from here. There are my two entries that have been physically updated. So that's basically saying what the editable grid will do. So that shows you how you can create one and how you can edit one. Now, the last thing I just wanted to touch on very briefly is that just a couple of things to watch for when you're doing your editable grids. One thing we have found is that sometimes when you have an editable grid and a non-editable grid side by side on the screen, sometimes the lines don't quite line up on here for the non-editable grid. That is something that is being fixed by Microsoft. It may even have come out in the last release for some people in terms of that. So that's just something to just watch and make sure that you know where your lining up is occurring. The other thing is when you are editing a record, so say we edit this record and we put in here, if you just come out of the record and don't save it, the system will not automatically update it. So here I've refreshed it. What I put in did not automatically go in. Even if I save the record here, it doesn't do it. So when you enter something, there's actually two ways that the system will accept it. If you put it in and then move down to another field, it will then grab it and add it in. And that should, if we just refresh this, yeah, you can see by moving down the screen, it actually accepted it. The other thing, though, is that is much safer, and the proper mode of doing this is to make sure that every time you enter something into the editable grid and you finish doing your editable grid change, you make sure that you do save the grid itself. Now, it may seem that when you save the record, you should be saving the entry of the grid, but bear in mind that the subgrid is basically a window to another entity. So by changing the record, you're not necessarily going to that other entity to save it as well. That's why the subgrid has to be saved when you're entering details into the subgrid. The other thing, as I've already pointed out, but just to confirm, to edit or enter that record that you're looking at the grid, sometimes you're not going to be able to just double click, because by double clicking, you're basically either, I mean, sometimes it will work like it did here, but sometimes it won't, because by clicking, you basically access what you're editing on the editable grid. So if you need to access the record, this little arrow at the end will always be your source to accessing the record. Now you'll also see that there's little arrows here. This would move you along if you had a scroll bar. So if you had a number of columns that went off the grid in the sense that you had more columns than the grid could show, then you can move along by looking at the arrows and moving in terms of along here. And this one specifically will take you from page to page with the number. Here you haven't got enough to go over the grid. So that is basically what we are covering today on the webinar.